Goldman. I'm the CEO of Grantmakers in Aging. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we are a community of funders mobilizing money and ideas to influence and strengthen policies, programs, and resources as we all age. And with our mission, we are very focused on how the way that we talk about aging can influence the solutions that we develop to improve the aging experience, can influence how we do or do not fund aging-related initiatives, as well as the policies that we put in place to ensure that we can all have a good later life. So, Reframing Aging is a social change movement that is designed to improve the public's understanding of what aging means and the many ways that older people contribute to our society. GIA is really proud to have incubated the collaborative of funders that founded and launched Reframing Aging back in 2014. And we remain actively engaged with our colleagues at GSA, who lead the National Center to Reframe Aging. GSA serves as the hub of the Reframing Aging movement now, and the National Center helps our network and those beyond our network to ensure that we're applying age-inclusive and bias-free language in all of our communications, and that we are most effectively framing aging issues. So to lead us in our discussion today, we've invited Trish D'Antonio, Executive Director of the National Center to Reframe Aging. Trish will also be doing a workshop in Detroit. And so we do encourage questions and comments, but through the chat, right? And now I'm going to turn it over to Trish.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. I am going to share my slide deck, and hopefully you are all seeing my actual slide right now, and you should see an introductory slide. If that's a good thing, can I get a thumbs up in the chat? I realize that this is, or I'm going to assume I'm doing well until you guys tell me no. But anyway, as Lindsay mentioned, the National Center to Reframe Aging is developed to counter ageism. We are dedicated to ending ageism by advancing an equitable and complete story about aging in America. The center is a trusted source for proven communication strategies and tools to effectively frame issues. And today, in particular, some of the work that we're going to do is how we frame our presentations. What do we need to think about as we are all gathering in Detroit to ensure we are sort of showing that we're putting our money where our mouth is, right? And we are ensuring that our language is the type of, the type of language that we know from our research that drives productive thinking about aging. So as Lindsay mentioned, GIA is part of the Leaders of Aging organizations and was the original grantee for the Reframing Aging initiative, along with these other aging organizations, which we all have common missions and work in aging, but maybe a little bit of a different perspective or a different group of members that we serve. And what the executive directors of these organizations identified in 2013, 2014 was that the problem of ageism and the many challenges it creates, we really need to understand that better, because we were constantly held back particularly in policy, right? And how could we ensure that people understand why aging is important? We do receive funding from 4 philanthropies, the John A. Harper Foundation, RRF Foundation for Aging, Scan Foundation, and Archstone Foundation. So if you are on the call, I can't see who's all on the call. So thank you so much for your support. We also receive support through some local and regional funders who are working more directly with local and regional colleagues to build the movement in their areas. So thank you as well for your support. And our partner, our research partner in this work is the Frameworks Institute. And I would assume that you are familiar with the Frameworks Institute, not only for their research in aging, but in other areas too. They've done considerable research in how we talk about early childhood development, vaccinations, work in culture change. And the Frameworks Institute works in the nonprofit sector solely to help create those messages and how, that research to help us learn how those messages can impact and change perspective from the public. Just to be sure that we're all just a level set for everybody. I think it's really important that we just very quickly talk about ageism and define that for us all. And we use definitions and frames that the World Health Organization uses. And think about this in the perspective that ageism exists in several forms. It refers to the stereotypes, so how we think, our prejudices, how we feel, and then that actual discrimination, how we act, right? And how that's directed to people on the basis of age. Now, notice I didn't say that it was on the basis of being an older person. We know that ageism exists across the life course. The work of the National Center to Reframe Aging does tend to shift toward older people. That's our goal, to end ageism toward older people. But ultimately, I think we all have to remember that ageism exists across the life course and that it exists on multiple levels. So we hear it in an interpersonal way, right? How many times have we heard, oh, she can't run that department. She's too young. She's just out of college. Or he can't do that. He's too old. He can't handle the technology. We hear compassionate ageism, and what does that sound like? Well, how many times do we hear elders speak, and we hear older people referred to as, oh, sweetheart, you don't look a day over 30 when you're talking to a 70-year-old person. Institutional ageism, those are the laws and the rules and the systemic norms and policies that impact or restrict opportunities because of someone's age. Right, so mandatory retirement at the age of 62, that could be considered an institutional practice. And then finally, self-directed ageism. And when we think about that, we hear it in conversations, probably in personal conversations, when someone will say something like, oh, my knee is giving me so much trouble. I guess that's just what it means to get old. Right. Well, we believe you that your knee could be giving you trouble. We believe you that you are aging. We do not believe you that the sole reason is how many birthday candles you've had on your cake this year as to why your knee is bothering you, and you need to go get it checked out. Now, this ageism starts in childhood, right? The communications that we hear, it's reinforced over time. So from an early age, children pick up these cues that are around them, and those cultural stereotypes start to become internalized. So it really is something that it is a life course issue that we need to address. Underlying this is our implicit biases, right? And we know that these implicit biases, these subconscious biases that we harbor, cause us to have feelings and attitudes about people based on characteristics. So one of those characteristics may be age, but we also know that that occurs based on race, ethnicity, appearance, in many different ways. These associations develop over the course of a lifetime, right? We are shaping these at an early age. Our research, fortunately, and particularly the research around reframing aging, has shown that when we make people aware of their implicit bias about age, we are able to start what we need to do for people to start to recognize that and start to make the change. So I think that's pretty exciting when you think that you really can make that change. So why are we reframing aging? Well, here's what we're up against. We've all seen in the lay press, in academic press, we have heard ageism's misperceptions in many ways with widespread impact, right? Workforce discrimination, right? The economic impact in our communities and on the people who live in our communities. How older people are limited in their ways to contribute when there's a policy that someone, whether it's an actual written policy where retirement is required at 62, or if it's an unwritten policy where people just stop getting those promotions or are invited to be part of different work groups in the office. There's also less supports for policies in aging that we see, right? So, think about how many times we are advocating for certain policies, and the thought, the response we get back is, well, I'd rather spend the money where we know we can make a greater difference and pit older people against children, as if that's the only solution that we have. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. One of the other things that I think is important, and many of you saw the cover article in the New Yorker that was published back in October of last year, where we show our leaders in a way that, number one, as if everyone is in decline, right? And you're in decline because you're using a walker. Well, as we work in aging, we know the importance of assistive devices. And one thing that we want to be sure we're communicating is that there's a value there of being able to use those assistive devices, because that's how you identify how you continue to participate in community and participate in society. The other thing that we often talk about when we talk about personal consumption is birthday cards. And I am happy to share that this week I just celebrated my 60th birthday. I'm happy to share how old I am. It's a good thing for us to share this. And my family made a comment that they all worked very hard to be sure they did not give me a birthday card that was ageist or made fun of age. And some of them said it was kind of hard, but they even found funny cards. So I think I'm going to copy those cards so that I can show them in the presentation. But in this card, we're not only making fun of these women's age, but one woman has what appears to be a disability, and we're making fun of that as if it's not a problem. Now, one of the things I think we have to recognize is we know that the cost of ageism in healthcare, from research from Becca Levy at Yale, is roughly $63 billion a year. Now imagine what we could do with $63 billion, if any, or even part of that, to be able to apply to what we need to do, that we know we need to accomplish in healthcare. So I want everybody to think about this. We have done this before. And the place where we've come to think about this to show that we can really shift a public mindset about an issue is when you think about secondhand smoke, right? And when we recognize the issues and the challenges of secondhand smoke and how we talked about it in a way of being a moral failure, that you couldn't give up smoking, and this smoking was not only impacting you, it's impacting your community. Well, when we shifted the language to talk about how it was impacting your community, right? The health of non-smokers at work has been, being exposed, that their health care has been impacted. When it went from a moral issue to a collective benefit issue, we were able to see the changes where we changed smoking in the workplace, where we changed policies at smoking in restaurants. And of course, right, the first responses that we heard were these smoke-free policies would have an adverse economic impact on businesses, would have an adverse economic impact on tourism. And yet what we learned that after establishing smoke-free workplaces in 2019, we have been able to see that these policies have not impacted. And in fact, in some areas, there have been some positive effects of these policies. So as we start to think about how good science documented the dangers of secondhand smoke and society responded and how we framed that made a difference, I'd like you to think a little bit about how we can really shift the conversation around aging and around improving how people think about us all as we age. So one of the things that we invite everyone to think about is how you contribute in the ecosystem to reframe aging. So are you an aging advocate? As a funder, how are you shifting language so that your boards understand more about the importance of recognizing how we become so much more different as we age, rather than thinking about us in one phase, term, or everything is about death, decline, and disability? Are you working in a sector where people might think, oh, we don't work in aging, but actually, who on this call is not aging? Now, I can't see all of you because of the way, but I would hope that we have every hand up. And if you think about it, we're all aging, right? We're aging since birth until we're not aging anymore, and that's death. So think about that and how maybe sometimes we don't use the words older people, but we are all aging, and we need to think about that and how we contribute in the ecosystem. So before I get to specifically about reframing aging, I want to be sure that we talk about why framing matters, right? And, we will look at some examples from some other areas. So we're going to talk about 3 very important reasons about why framing matters. Framing can make a difference in how people understand your message. It's a part of a critical social change strategy. Framing is about choices, right? We are all communicators. We are framing in our professional jobs. We are framing personally. And we are making those choices about what to emphasize, how to explain it, and then even what doesn't get said, right? So when you think about that, those frames drive your listener to choices, right? Whether we're conscious of those choices or not, how that frame is driving us to those choices. So we need to think about how our communication choices can drive certain patterns of thinking. And when we have the research that supports us to tell us how this happens, we really can be intentional and deliberate in the frames that we choose. Now, some of you may have heard me speak before, and I talk often about how I frame messages to my husband about where we're going on vacation. And I do that by emphasizing he loves things that are free. He loves things that are discounted. He loves museums and history. So I often talk about the museums. I talk about how we live in the Washington, D.C. area, so we have a membership to Smithsonian, and that gives us discounts at some other museums, so he loves hearing that. I explain how we're going to an area where he likes to hike, so there'll be some great places for hiking and all. What I'm going to leave out is that it takes us 5 hours to drive there, and 3 of those hours will probably be in traffic, because I know he hates that. And I'll be the person who's driving in traffic, so I just give that part up and say, all right, that's fine. So we all frame. I share this story just so that you could think about that, how we all frame. Think about when you're trying to get a new project approved, a new budget line approved, and how you frame that message. It's really important about how we communicate these. Now, what we know from our research, right, is that there are many cultural models available to us in that split-second decision that we make when we hear, when we read, when we are digesting the communication, right? Now, in aging, the dominant assumptions are primarily negative about aging. So what I mentioned earlier about death, decline, and disability, predominantly we're thinking along those lines. But when we know that, we know how we can act, when we know what activates those productive models and thinking about aging. Notice I'm not saying positive. This is not a Pollyanna story about aging, right? We recognize that there's frailty in aging. We recognize people have multiple chronic conditions. We also recognize that there are people who are aging who are very healthy. So we have to recognize all of that and all of our differences as we age. So I would like for you guys, if you don't mind, and I think I'd be able to see this, I wanted you to think about some framing choices that you make. And as you're thinking about developing your presentation, right? The work that you're going to bring in October in Detroit to the meeting. Think about ways that examples of choices in your presentation. And I'm going to give you one example. How about some of the pictures that you might use? Some of the visuals that you use, if you're trying to think of like what other ways that this impacts. And now I'm going to take the risk to see if I can see your chat. Let's see. I don't see the chat, unfortunately. Lindsay or Alice, are you able to kind of let me know if there's... Oh, wait, I figured out how to see the chat. It was behind a screen. Sorry about that. Oh, and thank you for those who wished me happy birthday. Using inclusive language, right, as we all age. Thank you. And Laura, I see intersection of ageism and sexism. Okay. So how are you going to show that on a slide? Think about that. How are you showing this on a slide? How are you conveying this to your audience? That kind of gives you a way that you're framing. Images of people of diverse ages and racial backgrounds, very good. And I would also, if you can show photos that also show maybe one person is using an assistive device in the picture. Not every picture, but if you can make sure that that's included. Our session is considering healthcare workforce, so it's important that any visuals we use are showing diversity of people who may work in healthcare and provide care to older adults. This is fantastic. This is great. I'm going to show you a couple other examples that I was thinking of and how this starts to inform our presentations, right? How about the tone that we use when we're speaking, right? The values that we bring into the presentation, right? So the values of what I heard is the values of intersectionality, right? When I read some of those examples out loud. How many of us are going to use statistics and data, right, to explain some of the work? How many of us are thinking about the order of our presentation, right? What happens first? What happens next when we give this presentation? Right? So this is all important because we want to make sure that when we are telling the story, right, we're driving thinking toward that idea that recognizes, as you all said, we are all aging and that we become so much more diverse as we age. So really, all of these types of framing choices start to play into our narrative, into our story. What's really important is they are part of the story. They don't drive the story. They're a character in our story. Ultimately, our goal here is that when our frameworks about aging, we know that knowledge increases, attitudes start to change, and ultimately policy support starts to grow. Many of you know some of the origins of our research and what we did to sort of map the terrain. What do aging advocates, what do people in the aging field, how do they answer certain questions? And how does the public answer questions? So how should we approach aging? We all embrace aging. We work in aging. It's not a surprise. And sometimes we, remember, we're members of the public. We battle aging. We hear about anti-aging creams. And hey, ladies, want to get rid of those crow's feet? And gents, what about that gray in your mustache or in your beard? One of the other things that I think is really important to highlight for you all, because it's just not something that we can go through each one of these. We could spend a whole hour just going through each one of these questions and what it means. But really, if you think about where this is on the radar screen for people, how big of a concern is ageism? And it's certainly a concern for us, right? We're dedicating specific time before you even come to the meeting to talk to you about this. Whereas in the public, it's absent from thinking. Now, I will say that there have been some things that have happened recently, COVID and actions that were taken where we specifically heard people over the age of 65 will not be treated. People over the age of 70 will not be treated with ventilators because we don't have enough. And it was simply age, simply chronological age, nothing about function. Also, in the political discourse this year, we have heard some statements about age, but people felt free to make those statements. Remember that there was kind of a conversation here that we really had to get out there and talk about how we can, why we need to be sure that age alone, right? It's about competence in a political election, not simply chronological age, that we need to be thinking about, right? But still, Americans have a short attention span, right? So people are just going back to their everyday work. And the key is that we have a you say they think challenge, right? And this is where, as experts in the field, as experts in our work, we put out a perfectly reasonable message. We believe, and amongst other experts, people understand what you mean, but your message is going out far beyond the experts that you are working with. And once that goes out there, there's not much that you can do. Remember, you're cueing people's models, those cultural models where everybody's making that split-second decision. And we know that when we start to talk about the elderly, we drive people toward thinking about frailty and dependency as if all people over age 60, over age 65 are frail and dependent. And we know that word choice matters. And so this is why there's been such a shift of how we abandon using the word senior when possible. And senior citizen, and we're moving toward using older person, older adult, because what we were learning in our research is when we asked who was most competent and who was least competent, you can see along that scale. You can also see what age, when we asked what age is a senior, what age is a senior citizen, what age is an older adult. Right? So ask an 18-year-old how old an older adult is, right? And we started to hear in the late 40s, early 50s, not quite the age group we want to get to. So really what we recommend are two things. If you can, use the term older person or older people. And really, if you mean a group of people age 65 to 75, right? So if you're describing a workforce issue and the research is talking about people age 65 to 75, make sure you define that, because saying people over the age of 60 is a 40-year age span. Of course, there are differences within that age span. What's also really important is that when we start to talk about how we are all aging, we drive and cue that mental model, that message of collective responsibility and collective benefit. Now, I want to go into a couple things about navigating the public understanding of aging and what we learned. And so there are certain traps that we want to avoid, and I'll go into them a little bit more specifically. And then there are strategies that we want to advance. But I'm going to show a video real quick because I think it'll take us through much quicker and it'll give me a chance to get a sip of water.
Something happens when we talk about aging. We care deeply. We have the facts. Yet, our message often doesn't get through. Why? It could be the way we're communicating. Research from the Reframing Aging Initiative has identified some communication traps, common practices that undermine our message. These traps include fatalism, fantastic examples, and false starts. First, fatalism. Take the silver tsunami, an unfortunate metaphor for the growing number of older people. Yes, it's dramatic, but it also creates an overwhelming sense that nothing can be done. Instead, offer concrete solutions in your messaging, early and often. Next, fantastic examples, sometimes called super seniors. Yes, it's wonderful when older people do incredible things, but featuring extraordinary individuals can be misleading. Instead, try to keep your focus on better opportunities and realistic supports for everyone. Finally, false starts. We've all seen presentations that start with a statistic, like, by 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 or older. This doesn't begin to tell the whole story of aging, and it's pretty boring. Instead, start strong with a shared vision, like, staying connected to family and community is important to all of us. This is a more engaging way to start, and you can build your communication or story from there. Changing the way we talk can change attitudes about aging. Find resources and get started at
So for the sake of time, trust me that the end are the commercials and show you the leaders of aging organizations, our funders that we already covered in the beginning. So a trap of individualism. How many of us have heard this trap that we can fall into? Right? To age well, all you have to do is exercise and eat healthy. What does that leave out when we say things like that? That your lifestyle choices are the only reasons. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have some sort of responsibility in that. You know, if you only would have started saving in your 20s, you'd have money for retirement now. What we're not hearing, what we're not thinking about is what surrounds us, right? Was I a single mother with 3 children? And so my goals were to make sure I kept a roof over their head and that they were educated and that they were fed well. So I wasn't putting money into retirement, right? So really how our social determinants of health really factor into this. When we talk about the us versus them, that othering of older people, when we talk about other people as they, really that can puts us into a trap of we can't support everyone, so we're going to just make sure that we support the needs of others, right? So really thinking about that marginalization of older people. I think the other thing is that there's like this conversation of digital incompetence. And I think the one thing that we all know and the one thing that we need to continue to educate people on is that there is across all ages, there you need to learn how to use different technologies. And when you learn, when you have interest and when you learn, you do well with them. And that can happen at any age. And that again, that zero sum, as if the only thing the only thing that would be of benefit is if we talk simply about how we reason for different people, and how that makes that pitting against one another, right? We have to put money into early childhood education, so we're not going to put money into aging services. We talked a little bit about the fatalism, and I'm gonna, if you will all indulge me, I'm gonna go in some slides a little bit further down the line, talk a little bit how we can start to talk about those statistics so that we don't drive fatalism, right? So when we start right away with heavy statistics at the beginning, which is how we've all been trained to talk about an issue, right? I mean, myself included, it really does start to give us some challenges, because then people start to think, I can't do anything about this. This is too much. What do you do when a tsunami is coming at you? You run, right? So really, I'm going to show you in a couple slides about what we say about statistics. We don't say don't use statistics. What we say is watch how you start with statistics. Maybe the statistics are the third sentence or the fourth sentence, where the solution is the first sentence. Again, that super senior story, right? It's really important that we recognize that there is context around that super senior story, right? So the 102-year-old man who completes a marathon, right? Well, there's all kinds of supports for him to be able to continue to run, recognize what surrounds him all his life. A 91-year-old attorney who continues to work. And there are workplace policies in there. There are policies around who's carrying the big heavy boxes, versus recognizing the momentum and recognizing the wisdom, the accumulated wisdom of that attorney, who can impart that with other colleagues, right? And teach that with other colleagues. What we really want to do is advance strategies to spark the more accurate conversation. And so quickly, I'm going to run through a couple of these because I want to get to some specifics around presentation. But when we talk about building the process of building aging as building momentum, right? This is an example of how you can see this without saying, oh, I have to stop and I have to reframe aging, from colleagues in the city of Boston, where when it came time to repaint their senior shuttles, rather than simply using the term senior shuttles, they are transporting Boston's most experienced people. And if you look on this second slide, you'll see where they add that. And think about what that means to a person who's riding the shuttle, a person who sees the shuttle, and the visitors to Boston. We really want to ensure in this story, right, that we are moving people's attitudes about aging, right? And as that starts to happen, it decreases that us versus them type of thinking, right? We see aging as opportunity. And so then we want to see the policy supports and the collective benefits that we can all accrue as we age. Another thing that I would put forth is, quite often we see people talk about frailty with paternalism. How many times do we hear people say our seniors or our older people, right? And we kind of want to cringe, right? But really, we want to make sure that when we're talking about vulnerability, when we're talking about frailty, the onus is not on the individual, right? The onus is on the system. So instead of this, where we'd hear people say, many people who are older are frail, vulnerable, cannot help themselves, and depend on others to meet their most basic needs, this leaves them at risk for all kinds of challenges, potential harms, and scams. I would put forth that you could say something like this: when community bonds are weak, older people who are frail are more at risk of experiencing harm. So we admit there are older people who may be more at risk. We need to build solid connections and strengthen our social structure to better support older people, families, caregivers, and our entire community. Because let's face it, we can all be susceptible to scams, right? I mean, it's not about only about older people. But see, again, our community bonds, our collective responsibility, bringing that into the work that we're doing. When we talk about advancing equity, right? In our conversations, we have some framing tips, and these are really important for us to think about, because, you know, we have to recognize, number one, that ageism is a problem that can be solved, right? So that's one thing that we know. And notice that it's ageism that we're putting the emphasis on here, not aging, right? Aging is not a problem, right? Aging is actually a good thing, as we've already established. But a couple of the things that we need to think about is we need to be able to take an intersectional and inclusive approach when we are communicating. We talk about being good framing neighbors, right? So we recognize that there's intersectionality, right? Why is this important, right? Why do we avoid comparing isms? Well, remember in our research, first of all, people reject ageism as a harmful form of discrimination, right? So that's one thing that it would be hard to bring that into the discussion. As a comparative frame is not an intersectional frame when you compare isms, right? That's not showing the intersectionality of those frames. And it misses the opportunity to really deepen the understanding of how equity works, right? And that's ultimately our discussion, our conversation, and this is what we're trying to advance. Remember that your audience doesn't always have the knowledge that you have about ageism and intersectionality, right? Most people don't know what you know. You're steeped in it in the work that you do, right? So now you have an opportunity in the public to really advance some critical message for a reader, for a listener, as you start to talk about ageism and intersectionality. We don't want to leave it up to a person. Remember to fill in the blanks with those easily accessible cultural models that may not get us to the message that we want people to accept, right? And lastly, we talk about reframe rather than rebut. And why do we do that, right? We know that if we start to rebut, we wind up in an unproductive debate, right? And people just walk away. So it's really important for us to remember that we want to probe, we want to learn more, and we want to continue to model the language we want people to use, right? And you'll start to see, people will notice that you're using certain language, and they will start to model that language. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is start with the highly innovative and creative solutions that drive us toward that can-do attitude, that emphasize the nature of the solution, and highlight the collective benefits. So one thing that we have to think about in framing when we are talking about numbers, which we always do in presentations, right? I did it here in presentations. We need to remember that numbers need a narrative. We can't just put the statistic out there, right? We need a narrative. And so here's an example where leading with data doesn't always work as we might have intended, right? So somebody could start a conversation, or somebody could, put a presentation out there and say, political inaction on gun violence is unacceptable. Now, we all believe that perhaps, but there are members of your audience, when they hear that, it's viewed as accusatory, right? And it's rather politically charged, right? Because there's an us and them there, of those of us who want to have guns, those of us who don't want to have guns. It doesn't matter to me where anybody is on this position right now, but just to kind of listen to how this changes. Another thing that we often talk about is new research reveals the impact of gun violence in our community. Well, whose research, right? We got to be sure we're putting the surround sound out about this, and make sure that the conversation is not focused on bias, but rather the guns and the solutions, right? So what we could do, though, is start to think about how we can all agree that reducing gun violence will do our community good, or do well for our community, right? We want to view, when we put something out like this, as inclusive, right? Try to get past political beliefs, right? Because we know that creates that rebut, right? And participants envision that a productive conversation will follow after statements like this. Here's another thing about numbers need a narrative. Here's an example, right? So add language to help people interpret what the number means, right? So our colleague at Frameworks, Maura O'Neill, said, when you talk about nesting numbers in narrative, remember that this is the seasoning. The numbers are the seasoning. They're not the whole dish that we're consuming, right? So instead of this, right, where we say in our community, 1 in 5 students has untreated oral disease. More than half our state's third grade children have had dental caries experience or cavity, right? Does this sound like a sentence that, or a statement that you would have heard in across your workplace? I mean, I think I've heard things like this. So we want to add the language that helps you interpret what the number means, right? And thinking about where we want to go with the systemic solution. So we could try something like this. Only 9% of dentists in our state accept dental insurance that covers 58% of children in our state. So now you can kind of see like where we are in this systemic issue that's here. This prevents access to oral health care, which is essential for overall health. So see how the emphasis is different? It's the same information. In fact, you could probably find both of these statements in the research that's produced here, right? In the policy brief. But where you start to drive thinking of like, oh, we can fix that. So just like words, images play an important role in implicit messages, right, that we send about older people. And I'm really excited. I mean, hopefully you're aware of some of the work that Frameworks has done with AARP, right, in talking about how we can select images, and there are images available, right? So thinking about 6 recommendations. When depicting older people with limited mobility, use images in which they are participating actively and engaged with people. When showing older people using technology, show images that signal comfort and competence. In most cases, avoid images of super seniors, right? These images in the work of that's my timer there. These images in the workplace, right? They depict older people as active contributors in community, right? Think about that. Use images of older people in the workplace to help see people that they see themselves, right? As active contributors in our communities. Images that depict older people in positive settings, engaged in positive activities are important. And then when possible, select images based on your target audience. So we know that when a frame works, it starts to shift thinking in multiple ways. And ultimately, knowledge about aging increases, attitudes about aging increase, and policy support grows, which is truly the vision for how the Reframing Aging Initiative started. So I want to show something that I think you probably all could see of a framing practice. And so instead of this, which I'm going to read it quickly, I think you might have all seen something like this in a report. Maybe you've written a report, something like this, but the CDC's Injury Center keeps a close eye on falls and falls-related injuries. And here's the hard truth. Every second of every day of every week, older adults 65 plus fall here in the US. These falls result in more than 3 million injuries treated in hospital ER departments annually. Falls result in over 800,000 hospital stays for Americans 65 plus and 32,000 deaths a year. But it's not just about the pain. Older adults know that even a fall without injury can shatter their quality of life. The fear of falling often triggers self-imposed limitations, eroding social connections and physical activity, and paving the way for depression, isolation, and helplessness. Okay, so remember, we are problem solvers. What are the solutions? How can we start to think about this differently, right? So we have our before, now we have our after. Rather than leading with the statistics, let's start with some solutions-based thinking. When community bonds are strong, we improve opportunities for social connectedness and quality of life for us all. Injuries from falls can impact our participating in community. Programs like the National Council on Aging's Falls Free Checkup offer free tools for us to recognize our risk for falls. We can learn how we can reduce our risk through exercise, medication review, home modifications, and more. And then I would put forth like maybe the second or third paragraph. You need some stats that back this up about why this works. So think about it. It really is how we frame it. How is our narrative getting us to think about that solutions-based thinking, that systemic solution-based thinking first? So some other quick tips for presentations. You'll all get a copy of this presentation. I think, a couple of things that are really important, and we talked about these, about using specific age ranges when you are talking about specific age ranges, right? Rather than just leave the interpretation to the listener when you say people over the age of 60. When we talk about older people, we find that we drive people to the right age group. It does draw to mind somebody who's in their 60s, and it does draw to mind somebody who is competent. We always use person first language, right? So person with diabetes instead of the diabetic patient, person with dementia instead of the I can't even say it, so I'm not going to say it. You guys know that. But really think about that. The graphics we just went through. Lead with your solution rather than leading with your statistics. The statistics will support your solution. So, but you'll get somebody starting to think about that. I wanted to remind you, if you're ever in a situation where somebody says, well, why am I using this language? If you are using the AMA manual of style or the APA manual of style as part of the work that you do, or even the Associated Press style book, all of those look at and include age-friendly communication. The language that we use that we talk about here, where we avoid using terms like seniors and the elderly, where we use terms like older people or the actual age group that we are referencing. There are other resources up on our website, including a quick start guide that take you through all of the traps. And rather than use this, try this. We showed you one of the videos. We have 4 videos in that series that are all around 2 minutes that can take you through some of the other traps, some of the other strategies to advance in our communications. And of course, we have a newsletter that we would suggest that subscribing to will help give you more resources and learn about what colleagues around the country are doing and how this work to reframe aging is being added to different initiatives in different areas around the country. So usually I say a month from now, but I say, let's set up a calendar reminder for October 7th, because I'm figuring that's about a week before, and that's when we're really starting to get serious about making sure that our slides are finished for the Grantmakers and Aging meeting. So at 9 a.m., create a calendar appointment that says, what have I done to ensure my presentation is well framed for the Grantmakers and Aging meeting? And if you're really interested in this, if you really want to advance this, start a recurring calendar appointment, and you could change it to, how am I applying the principles to reframe aging? And in the message, drop some of these links, because you want to go back and say, what did she say about this? Or attach the presentation that we gave today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Lindsay and say thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Look forward to seeing you all in Detroit. I think it's going to be a fantastic meeting.
Thank you so much, Trish. Every time you present, and I've seen you present several times, I always learn something new. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. We really appreciate your taking the time to learn with us. And as you're developing your presentations for the upcoming conference, please keep these framing strategies in mind. Consider the framing both professionally when you're talking about the work that you do and your funding, but also personally, how you talk about your own age. Please don't make any self-deprecating jokes about your own age. Feel free to deprecate yourself in any other way, but not about your age. You'll receive the slides and the recording from this webinar. And as Trish said, the National Center has so many valuable multimedia resources to assist you as you're developing your talking points. Please complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen when we end. It really helps us to improve our programming. And we can't wait to see all of you in Detroit. Be well and have a good weekend.